My father died when I was 3 years old. He was in the Navy in World War II at the time. And so I never knew him. I didn't know anything about him. Later I'd asked my mother, I said, why did my father die? And she'd say, well, a man came to power in Germany called Hitler, and when he came to power, and I would say, well then why did he come to power if he's such a bad guy? And she would say, because when he came to power there were good people in Germany who could have stopped him, who stayed silent. So in my family, that became kind of the legend, the organizing principle, that when something like that happens, you can't stay silent. So you can imagine that today, Donald Trump is up there talking away. This is a hard time to stay silent. And so I think it's really important that all of us have to try to figure out ways of involving our friends, our neighbors, our community in a larger way. Because if we stay silent, we may get what we deserve. What happened to you when you came to America? Some people will say, I was welcomed there. And when something horrible happened to the family, when the father was arrested and taken away, people stood up and supported him. And therefore, I love this country. And other people will say, when something really bad happened, no one stood up. We were the object of ridicule and hatred. And therefore, I cannot relate to this country. And that is true in the Muslim community, it's true in the African American community, Black Lives Matter, it's all across the board.
So we are really lucky to have Steve Downs here today to speak to us. And Steve has worked in support of Muslims in Islam and on many FBI entrapment cases. As you know, Albany actually has quite a strong tradition of protecting civil liberties and freedoms and rights, and supporting our Muslim neighbors through the Muslim Solidarity Committee and other work. And Steve Downs, Esquire, graduated from Amherst College in 1964. Boy, you old, Steve.
I am. Ancient dinosaur.
And Cornell Law School, and after serving in the United States Peace Corps in India, he was the Chief Attorney of New York State Commission on Judicial Conduct from 1974 to 2003. And he was part of the defense team in the U.S. versus Yassin Aref. And Yassin Aref, in case you don't know, was the imam in Albany who was entrapped by the FBI and illegally convicted. Not to go into any great detail, but when secret evidence is used in a case to convict somebody, there's something terribly wrong. There is no defense against secret evidence. There should never, ever be anything called secret evidence. Anyway, Steve is the founder, one of the founders of Project Salam, and he became the executive director of National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms in 2012, and he's had a lot of experience working with the Muslim community. So please welcome Steve Downs.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm kind of overwhelmed by the turnout. This is really great. And so many friends and faces here. When John asked me to do this talk, I said, sure, I mean, this is what I do. You know, I'm glad to do it. And then I realized that he was actually asking me to do something slightly different. He was asking me to talk about standing up for your Muslim neighbor, which, of course, my whole background, all of this is about civil rights. It's not quite the same thing as standing up for your Muslim neighbor. And I assume I don't have to persuade any of you that we need to stand up for our Muslim neighbors. We also have to stand up for our Hindu neighbors, for our Christian neighbors, for the Jewish neighbors, for everybody. We need to stand up for our neighbors. But particularly when there are times when they come under attack unfairly, and that's where we are right now. We have a situation where one group is being demonized by another. One of the things that I learned as working on these cases is that I was unable to trust the government. When they said something, there was a lot of misinformation which they put out. The media picked up on it, and the basic rule was if the government said it, it must be true. If somebody else said it wasn't true, that was alleged. And you see that pattern constantly. constantly. And so it allowed the government to paint I think, a very false narrative. We have to be able to stand up. And I realize that in a sense that is the first problem that we have to get past. All of us probably in one way or another have stood up. That is to say, we've accepted the responsibility to do something about a situation that we're not technically responsible for, but has to be dealt with if we're going to live in the kind of country we want to live in. So standing up is that first problem, and I sort of think of it as a gateway problem. I started in on, I think, one of the first ways that we stand up for our neighbors, our Muslim neighbors. And that is on the issue of civil rights. The idea that the community itself is not being treated in a legal, in an equal way. The law is supposed to apply equally to all people. And the minute you start to treat one group differently, all of us are in danger. And I've seen that too, because among the various tactics that the government uses, the entrapment tactics, the surveillance tactics, the secret evidence tactics, the terrifying, making the jury afraid tactics, out of all of these various tactics, I've seen them now applied to environmentalists, to animal rights activists, to peace activists, to communists and anarchists and other leftist groups. And all of this is done in the sense of using the terrorist label. It's very easy to label people as terrorists, but the term has been so misused and so used in such a broad sense that it is virtually meaningless, and you end up with a system, a legal system, which endangers all of us, because if the government can go after a Muslim group and do this to us, they can do it to any of us. One of the best ways to engage the Muslim community, or any community, is not necessarily to go and say, hey look, we think you're being unfairly targeted, we want to be your friends, but first, before we can be your friends, we have to resolve all outstanding religious questions between us. And this is a sort of a guaranteed way not to get anywhere. We're simply talking about the legalities of these cases, about the civil rights, about the needs of the community to be safe. And as a result, we established very close friendships and relationships based not on religion so much, but on a shared understanding of who we were as people. And so I think that's the next stage that you sort of go to. You go to understanding who these communities are, where they come from, and what are their real needs. And listen, we all have stories. Every one of you have it. But in trying to stand up for our Muslim neighbors, we have to understand their individual stories, who they are. One of the biggest issues, I think, from sometimes with my friends who cannot relate is that they can't pronounce the names. They can't get past the names. And so I try every time I sit down to give them just one or two names and say, see if you can remember these two names. And then next time I'll give them two more names. Try to do these two names. Because once you can remember the name, you can remember the story. And once you can remember the story, you can go to the next stage, which is to tell the story to their friends. And the stories pass out through the community. These are all stories that have in one way or another passed out through the community. I do think that we should make a big effort to try to take in refugees. Refugees are a wonderful gateway into the whole immigrant community and the whole experience of many of the Muslims in this country. We talked about having a speakers bureau, a way of having people come to mosques, particularly to mosques, but to probably any place that they felt comfortable. Because there's so much fear in the country right now, and people want to have a way to ask questions, particularly to Muslims, and say, this is what I heard, is it true? Can you talk to me about it? And so I think we need to set up places like that where people can safely raise the concerns that they have. And I know the Muslim community has been making a lot of outreach. And one of the things that we suggested of doing was to try to reach out to the public by having resolutions adopted by the local governments. And we wrote up some resolutions, and they're going to be presented to the Albany Common Council and to the county government.